Ketevan, thank you very much for the update. Ketevan Gojasani reporting there for us from Washington. We're going to stay with the story next and bring in Wesley Martin, a retired U.S. Army colonel and former U.S. Antiterrorism Officer in Iraq. Thank you very much for joining us here on France 24. Now, in a statement from President Biden on Colin Powell's passing, he said Powell was a patriot of unmatched honor and dignity. How would you describe Colin Powell's record of public service?
It was mentioned earlier that he was a role model for African American soldiers. He was a role model for all of us. He always maintained himself with a quiet dignity. And if we go back and we look at Desert Storm, the leader of the ground forces, Norman Schwarzkopf, big, rotund, very vocal, very forceful. And yet you had a man of incredible combat background as his supervisor, Colin Powell, and it was a perfect balance. We could not have had two Norman Schwarzkopfs. We needed somebody more with quiet dignity and presence to back up the aggressive, on-ground, bombastic commander of Norman Schwarzkopf. They were both ideal in what they did. And his record throughout, he was trapped in a bad situation on the briefing before the United Nations. He was given bad information by State Department, by Central Intelligence Agency, and by Defense Investigative Agency. And at one point, he even said, I can't use this because as former national security advisor and as a warrior and as a commander of troops, he saw flaws. And he told George Tenet, if I'm going to present this information at the UN, you're going to be sitting behind me. But Powell was the man, even though he objected to it, and he told Bush, and he told Rumsfeld, and he told Cheney, Vice President Cheney, you have got to allow diplomacy to work. He was constantly pushing for diplomacy, and yet when it came time that he, as Secretary of State, had to be pushed into it, he did step into the ranks, and he did go forth and give the briefing. And later he actually said, people will never trust me again. It hurt him.
I want to talk about that UN speech, in fact, because during that speech he spoke about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. He spoke not just of facts, not of assertions rather, but of facts. And given that speech shaped U.S. foreign policy for 2 decades or so, how damaging was it to his career?
The speech didn't so much damage his career as Secretary of State, and I'll get to that in a minute, but it did once we got into Iraq, and I was the anti-terrorism officer in the country at the time. And first off, let me say this. We had no legal reason to go into Iraq. Saddam was not a good person. I dealt with Saddam face-to-face later when I was the operations chief for Task Force 134 detention operations. Saddam was not a good person. He would shake your hand, smile, but then he'd throw you into the wood chipper. But he did maintain a fine balance of power between Iraq and Iran. And as long as Saddam stayed in power, then we were going to have stability into the Middle East. That invasion ended up causing the breakdown of stability. Iran became the dominant force in Iraq. And now you see that reign of terror going all the way across Iraq. And look at the election going on right now in Iraq and all the turmoil. Syria, Yemen, Lebanon. We totally destroyed that fine balance of power. But what undermined Powell within the Bush administration was Vice President Cheney and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. President George W. Bush surrounded himself with his father's friends, but he did not have the intellect to deal with his father's friends. And those neoconservatives were always undermining everything Powell was trying to do, to include Condoleezza Rice. He was treating her like a daughter, and she should have been supporting him, but she didn't. That is what politically forced Powell to leave the administration. Go ahead.
Colonel, you did mention this briefly. You were talking about Colin Powell shattering, trailblazing, if you will, for the African-American community. Do you think the former Secretary of State was aware of all the doors he was opening for African Americans? Because back then, no one really talked about him shattering glass ceilings or being a trailblazer because it just happened. Nowadays, things are different.
he had to realize, but here's the thing about Colin Powell and all professional soldiers. They do their job. And as Colin Powell was leading what would come behind him, he was too busy doing his job with dignity to make a great deal about how he was shattering glass ceilings. He was going out there and doing what a fine warrior and a fine soldier does.
Wesley Martin, Colonel, thank you very much for speaking to us here on the program this evening.
Thank you.